Hi, everybody. My name is Kat Rowland. As Gohar said, I'm the Legislative Affairs Director at the Progressive Caucus Action Fund. And I'm so glad to be here because this is a really critical moment for those of us working to achieve our policy priorities in Congress. We are on the cusp of a super busy couple of months on Capitol Hill when a lot of work happens to advance some of the biggest must-pass bills. The windows of opportunity for Congress to move legislation are extremely narrow this year. And when those opportunities are limited, getting priorities included in must-pass bills that are sure to become law becomes all the more important. So that brings me to the topic at hand, how to make the most of must-pass bills. I'm going to show a few slides, which we will share after today's meeting. So please don't feel the need to write everything down. We're also going to share a more detailed explainer on must-pass bills. So I will get started with the operative question, what is a must-pass bill? They are bills that Congress must pass to avoid something undesirable happening. Sometimes that undesirable outcome has practical implications, other times political ones, and sometimes both. For example, if Congress fails to pass an appropriations bill to fund the government shuts down, and that has huge practical consequences for the economy and for government programs and services. On top of that, the public and the media are going to blame Congress and the White House for those consequences, causing a political problem. Next slide, please. Now that we've defined what a must-pass bill is, I want to talk about how they're used. And I'm going to highlight three of the most common approaches. One is attaching a policy rider, two, inserting an earmark, or three, using a must-pass bill to, quote, move the needle. I'm going to start with policy riders. Must-pass bills can be used to advance policies that may be unlikely to become law as standalone bills, either because they're just not a high priority for other members or because they lack sufficient support. These policies are often called riders because they advance by hitching a ride on a must-pass legislative vehicle. I'm going to give an example of one of the most notorious policy riders, the Hyde Amendment, which is named for its author, the late Congressman Henry J. Hyde. It first passed in 1976 and prohibited coverage of abortion care under Medicaid. For decades, it's been attached to a must-pass bill, the annual appropriations bill that funds the Department of Health and Human Services. This prevents insurance companies run by HHS, like Medicaid, Medicare, CHIP, and the Indian Health Service, from covering abortion. Over time, the Hyde Amendment was added to other appropriations bills, expanding the populations impacted by abortion coverage bans. The fact that this policy is still blocking access to healthcare nearly 50 years after it first passed speaks to the far-reaching implications that policy riders can have. Next, I want to talk about earmarks. An earmark's an allocation of federal funding that members of Congress request for a specific project, typically within their districts. A moratorium on this practice was put in place in 2011, but it was reinstated for the current Congress with new safeguards in place to make sure members can't use earmarks to enrich themselves. Lots of earmarks were included in the final 2022 appropriations bill that was signed into law in March. Members won funding for lead pipe replacements in Michigan, substance use treatment services in Massachusetts, housing for young adults experiencing homelessness in Texas, and a lot more. So this year's government funding bill, already a must-pass bill, took on extra importance for members and for their communities seeking earmarked funds. Now, even though must-pass bills have been used successfully to advance major priorities, like in the examples that I just shared, this is not always possible. A policy might face too much opposition to advance even as part of a must-pass bill. And in those situations, including the policy could sink the bill altogether. However, this does not mean that no progress is possible. A member can offer a narrower version of their policy or pursue another option that moves the needle in favor of their policy, like requiring a study from the Government Accountability Office that could make the case for their policy change. This is obviously a more incremental way to achieve change, but it can be a valuable option when other paths don't pan out. Now, to use a must-pass bill successfully, you have to know the key moments and players in that bill's development. Because, as I mentioned, Congress has to pass appropriations bills every year, I'd like to zoom in on their development and hopefully leave everybody with a better understanding of the critical organizing moments. We'll do this now with a brief video, which again is going to be shared with you after this session. The final issue that I want to talk about is how to anticipate opportunities within must-pass bills. The first step is knowing which must-pass bills are on the horizon. And I've listed a number of them on this slide, but I want to share a bit about how I came up with that list. Appropriations bills and the National Defense Authorization Act are considered annually, so we know to expect those. Outside of those more predictable bills, there are a couple of ways to forecast what's coming up. First, you can look at the funding authorizations that are expiring in the year ahead to anticipate which spending authorities Congress might need to renew. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, publishes that list annually, but Congress isn't necessarily going to act to extend every authority set to expire. To figure out which ones Congress will act on, it's useful to look back at prior years. For instance, roughly every 5 years, Congress passes what's called the Farm Bill, which is a comprehensive bill about food and agricultural policy. Because this bill is typically being reconsidered every 5 years, we can anticipate when Congress will work on a new farm bill. Another way to anticipate must-pass bills is to keep an eye on statements from congressional leaders and committee chairs, since they often work to draw attention to high-priority legislation. We've seen this with the Senate's U.S. Innovation and Competition Act and the House's America Competes Act, which congressional leaders in the White House have said is a top priority. While the House and Senate are still working out the differences between their versions of this legislation, there's every indication that they consider this a must-pass bill. Let me close by saying determining what is or isn't a must-pass bill is not an exact science, but But I hope the conversation we'll have today makes it easier for all of you to figure out what legislation Congress will act on and how to use that legislation to advance your priorities. Thanks so much for having me and looking forward to talking about this further.